Hi guys, Carthenian here, and welcome back to our Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 Learn to Fly series. In the last couple of videos, I gave an introduction to the series and we went over some of the basic simulator settings and planned a little discovery flight around Cleveland. In this video, we'll make sure we have some basic controls mapped and we'll take a look at the Cessna 152, fire it up, and begin our flight. And now here we are at Burke Lakefront Airport. Go ahead and click on Ready to Fly. This starts us off in the driver's seat. You can go ahead and close the checklist and ATC windows if they're open. Let's just get those out of our way. Now hit the N key and we'll take a look at the outside of the airplane. If you have a HUD up, this helps you if you want to fly the plane from this view. I don't use it because normally I use this view to take screenshots. You can turn it off and on by pressing Escape, going to General, and then going to the Camera tab. In the search box, type in HUD and you can toggle the instrument head-up display on and off. Just don't forget to hit Apply and Save. Here, if you toggle press the mouse scroll wheel, you can use your mouse along with the scroll wheel to pan and zoom around the plane. Now, just as Brett and Jermaine do when they're trying to court a young lady who could have been a part-time model, we can walk around the outside of, well, in our case, our airplane. In the real world, pilots will do a walk-around or pre-flight inspection of their plane. In our case, we can simulate that by moving the control surfaces and making sure controllers are connected, mapped, calibrated, and in proper working order. So what I usually do is position the camera above and behind the plane and then start going through my controls. The controls will be different depending on your peripheral. If you're not sure what they're going to be, you could just guess or you could search for them. I'll show you how in a minute. For now though, I'll just run through mine real quick. So in my case, if I turn the yoke, I should see the ailerons and the wing move. To remember which way they're supposed to move, I use the rule of thumbs. In other words, with my hands on the yoke, as I turn the yoke, my thumbs point to the aileron that moves up. So if I move the yoke to the left, my thumbs point to the left and I should see the left aileron move up. And if I move the yoke to the right, my thumbs point to the right and I should see the right aileron move up. If I pull the yoke back, my elevator moves up to push the tail down, which pushes the nose of the airplane up. And pushing in should give you the opposite. The elevator moves down, which will push the tail up, which pushes the nose down. So it looks like my yoke is good to go. Finally, left rudder, right rudder. Great, pedals are working. Okay, everything looks good and feels good. My controls are clamped down and I'm all adjusted and set. If you were hoping for a more detailed walk around, which would have covered the various parts of the Cessna that are modeled in the sim, I'll get to it in a future video. Let's hit the N key and go back inside. Okay, remember when I said we were deferring the control mappings to a later time? Well, our time has come. Just like when we were outside, you can toggle the scroll wheel for mouse look. You can also use the arrow keys to move the camera around. You can click on the yoke to make it disappear, allowing you to access what it was obscuring. Let's first check out the elevator trim. That's this little wheel down here. We'll use this in our flight to make the airplane easier to control the way we want it to. So let's go ahead and press Escape and then click Controls. Here, we'll see a tab for each controller we have connected to the sim. For me, you can see that I have my flight yoke system and rudder pedals connected. Now, if we go ahead and click on keyboard and make sure the search boxes are empty besides the helper text, we can enter elevator trim in the search by name box. And we can see it's already brought up all the keyboard shortcuts related to the elevator trim. The two we're worried about here is the elevator trim down, and elevator trim up, nose up. Here we can see they're mapped to numpad 7 and 1, which is fine, but I want these to be mapped to the primary device I'm going to be using to control the aircraft, which for me is going to be my yoke. It might be a flight stick or gamepad in your case. The point here is that the elevator trim is a control that's kind of like the cruise control in your car. It's something you want to be able to adjust without taking your hands off the wheel, at least for now. Either way, you don't want to be hunting around for it. You want to be able to access it by touch alone. So I'm going to click on my Flight Yoke System tab. Notice it's already got it mapped to a couple buttons here. It may have mapped them somewhere else in your case, so you might want to cycle through your peripherals to see if that's true, but for me, it's on my yoke. Notice from the diagram, it's hard to tell which keys A1 and A2 are. So if I click on search by input while leaving the elevator trim filter in the box above, I can just start hitting buttons on the yoke until I find the right one. So that's not it. That's not it. And low. You can tell that it's the right control because it says so in the box and the elevator trim description comes back up. For me, it's this momentary rocker switch on the left side of my yoke. The takeaway here is that I want to make sure we know where the elevator trim up and trim down buttons are and that we can get to them without taking our eyes off the screen. If you need to map it to something to ensure this, go ahead and do so now. One other thing to keep in mind is that if you do need to remap it, you'll want the nose up key to be positionally less than the nose down key. And what I mean by that is for my rocker switch, I move the switch down for nose up trim and up for nose down trim. If it was a set of buttons, you'd want the lower button to be nose up and the upper button to be nose down. If it's a slider, then moving the slider to the left would be nose up and moving it to the right would be nose down. That's how most aircraft are set up, and if I had to guess, it's to mimic the way the yoke or stick moves, towards us or down for nose up and away from us or up for nose down. It sounds a little confusing at first, but hopefully it will become more clear once we're up in the air. Anyway, make sure to hit apply and save any settings if you've changed anything and want to keep it. The other controls which I want us to know where they're at, and these are even more essential in some ways in the elevator trim, are cockpit quick view left and cockpit quick view right, cockpit view upper, and reset cockpit view. These will allow you to quickly glance left and right and move your head up and down inside the aircraft so you can easily see outside and catch visual references. The other way to look around is again to use the scroll wheel to toggle mouse look in combination with the arrow keys. For views in the future, I'll be using TrackIr, which tracks my head movement so I can just turn my head in real life to look around. Even with that, though, I'll still use the cockpit quick views if I need to look to the side without having to hold my head at a strange angle relative to the screen. I found TrackIr to be a great addition to the sim, as well as cheaper than getting a VR headset. And if you want to go down that route, Huddison again has a video on a TrackIr alternative, and I've even heard of an app that allows you to use your phone to track your head movement, so I haven't tried that one myself. Head tracking can add a lot of immersion, but it's an effort to set up and get used to, so keep that in mind. There will definitely be a learning curve and warm-up period. At any rate, I went ahead and provided links in my video description to Huddison's alternative, as well as a great video on calibrating TrackIr by Jabbers in my video description below. Now make sure you have the throttle set to something easy for you to get to. Then check out what you have your brakes mapped to. My rudder pedals have toe brakes, which I activate by rotating the pedal downwards, and there's a brake on each side, which gives me differential braking. This can help out for making near zero turns. Finally, make sure you know which buttons to set the flaps. You can leave these mapped to a keyboard button for now, as we won't need to constantly use them, and you could even just find it on the instrument panel and set it that way, but you should be aware of where it is at least. Looks like by default it's F6 to decrease and F7 to increase. Hit apply and save if you made any changes and you want to keep them, and then return to the cockpit view. Here we can see the trim wheel moving. I'm changing it with the rocker switch on my yoke. It wouldn't be sufficient to just click on the wheel because it would be cumbersome to get to, and you will need to make very minute changes to the trim which aren't really feasible with the mouse. Note the indicator where the trim is set to the left of the wheel here. With all the built-in planes, you can ignore the markings. From my experience with the sim, they're just there for show. Takeoff trim is always in the middle of the indicator, and that's where we want it to start. You can tell you're in neutral takeoff range by the mouse hover text. The black and red knobs here are throttle and mixture. If you have the mixture mapped to something, make sure it's set to max it and full rich. If not, just make sure this mixture knob is full in. We won't need to worry about it for this flight. Also make sure the throttle is at idle, which is pulled all the way out. To the right of that is a flaps lever. F6 to decrease, F7 to increase, or in my case, I also have it mapped to a button. Make sure it's at 0. The indicator won't move with the lever because we don't have the battery on yet. Okay, once you're all set, go ahead and hit the reset cockpit view button and let's get started. Let's make it official. Go ahead and turn on the flashing beacon. This lets everyone know in the area that we're about to turn the engine on. Now let's yell outside at anyone who may be playing around the plane and let them know they better shake that booty real quick. Clear prop. Now, since this is a discovery flight, we're going to cheat. Just hit Control E and the sim will start the engine for you. One last thing before we get going. Let's familiar ourselves with a couple instruments. The one in the upper left corner here, that's called the airspeed indicator, and it tells us how fast the air is moving around our wings, which gives us some indication of our speed. We want to keep the needle in this green arc here and no sudden or full force movements if we're in the yellow. We definitely never want to meet or exceed the red mark. The white arc here tells us where we can use flaps. The speed in this plane is measured in knots or nautical miles per hour. The speed we want to note here is right past this tick mark indicating 50 knots. When we go to take off, when the needle points to 55 knots, we can gently pull a yoke back a little bit towards us to lift the plane off the ground. This is known as rotation, and 55 knots is our rotation speed. The one off to the right here is the altimeter, and it reads like an analog clock. So if you don't know how to read an analog clock, you may want to look it up. But briefly, the small hand here points to thousands of feet, while the large hand here points to hundreds of feet. So you can see I'm right at around 590 feet since the small hand is below the 1, meaning I have to be less than 1,000 feet, and the large hand points to right before the 6. You can deduce the tick marks to mean 20, 40, 60, 80, and I'm right here past the 80. The other hand, this super small one with the arrow indicator extending to the readout here measures tens of thousands of feet. So here you can see it's way below 1, meaning we're at way less than 10,000 feet. Now, if your altimeter doesn't match up with mine, you probably didn't choose clear skies weather. The altimeter functions like a barometer, so the readings will vary with changes in the outside air pressure. Use a knob here to adjust the reading so it reads 590 feet. You can also just hit the B key and it will automatically calibrate. Finally, the gauge below the altimeter is the vertical speed indicator, or VSI. It tells us how fast we're climbing or descending in hundreds of feet per minute. So up for a climb of 500, 1,000, and so on, and down for a descent of 500, 1,000, and so on. The gauge is very sensitive and it lags behind what the plane is actually doing, so you really don't want to be fixated on it. You can tell you're climbing or descending by looking at which way the big hand of the altimeter moves and glance at the VSI to give you some idea of how fast. Finally, take a look at this gauge over here. This is the tachometer. And for the most part, we just want to make sure that when we're cruising, we keep the airplane in this green arc here. But every now and then, I'll tell you to set power to a specific RPM. Okay, one last thing. This little arrow up here exposes the toolbar, which has a lot of nifty menus in it, some of which we'll get into. The button we should be aware of, though, all the way to the left here, is the active pause button. Let's just pause the sim in case we need to check on something or go take care of business. Something we definitely wouldn't be able to do in the real world. While we're in here, let's remove a wind layer. This should help make your landing a bit easier so you don't have to worry about the rudder pedals as much on approach. Click on the cloud icon. Click on this little icon to the left of ground level here. Now click delete layer. Okay, with all that out of the way, we're finally ready to get started. This is already a pretty long video, so we're going to skip the checklist and ATC stuff for now. Okay, so on the ground, we're going to use the rudder only to steer the plane. There's often a mechanism attached to the nose gear so that it turns with the rudder while you're taxiing. If you need to make really tight turns, you can deflect the rudder fully while holding in the brake only for that side. For this plane, once you release a park and brake, it's going to want to move. If not, you can bring in a lever throttle to help it break the coefficient of friction or overcome the wind, then pull the power back out. We use a rudder to steer, and if you've got pedals, you can use the toe brakes to slow down. Normally, we want to avoid braking as much as possible. This helps prevent things like bald spots in the tires. With the default 152, though, this thing just doesn't want to stop, so you'll probably have to use the brakes even with idle power. Okay, here we go. I like to sit a little higher up. It's closer to how I'd sit in a real thing and lets me see out the window a little bit better while keeping the top row of instruments in sight. This knob here is a parking brake, and when you're ready, let's go ahead and release it. Give a little gas if it doesn't want to start rolling, then pull the power back to idle once it does. Keep the speed down to a brisk walk or jog. Brake if you have to, and try not to hit anything. Veer off to the left here. Cross this dash line and then start following the solid yellow one. I'll get into what some of these markings mean in a later video. Just keep it slow and steady and try weaving around if you want to. Get used to steering with your feet or twisting the joystick maybe to control the aircraft. Don't worry about these taxiway lights. This airport wasn't modeled correctly and it's kind of glitched. They wouldn't be where they are in the real world, and it's nothing for us to worry about. Looks like we got a van up here. This guy. What's he doing? Just steer around him. So yeah, if we had used ATC and gotten clearance to taxi, we probably would have got a heads up from lakefront ground. But the AI in Flight Sim is still pretty silly. You wouldn't really have people just going for a cruise around the taxiway like this in real life. That's actually what the dash line we crossed back there meant. When we crossed the dash line, we entered into a controlled area, and any vehicle in the controlled area has to be in constant communication with the airport ground service. That goes for planes, shuttles, and even emergency vehicles. But I guess we can only expect so much out of the sim for now. If it really bothers you, you can go into the options and turn down the airport vehicle traffic. It is kind of funny though, so I'm keeping mine where it is just for the lulz. The sim obviously has a lot of funny quirks like that just crack me up. We're going to see a lot of mayhem in our travels together. Try not to use the differential brakes to steer, only use these to slow down. And again, in the real world, we would really try not to use these very much at all. If you're using a yoke, keeping a hand on the yoke while you taxi is a good habit to get into. In the real world, you'd have to keep the ailerons adjusted into the wind, and if it's gusty, keeping your hands on the yoke would prevent the ailerons from being banged around and beat up by the wind. The wind banging around the ailerons really isn't modeled in the sim, but if you go to fly for real, maybe committing one hand to the yoke even when taxiing will impress your instructor. Maybe. And like I said, it's fine for now if you want to weave around and get a handle on how the airplane feels on the ground, but otherwise, when we're taxiing, we want to keep the nose wheel right on the CL line here. No faster than a brisk walk or jog. So just some real quick notes about the route I've chosen for us. We're taking off here from Burke Lakefront Airport. We're then going to turn south around downtown Cleveland and fly towards our first waypoint, Charlie Foxtrot Delta Zulu Bravo. Charlie Foxtrot Delta Zulu Bravo is a computer navigation fix. A computer navigation fix helps aircraft GPS systems navigate from point to point, and they may not be known by air traffic control or even show up on navigational charts. In our case, I just chose it because it shows up in the Flight Sim flight planner and it gives us a direction to fly towards, since it will give us a visual marker once we're up in the air. That's about it for that waypoint. It doesn't really bear any kind of visual significance, and it just gives us a marker to fly south to. And in our flight, we probably won't even fly directly to it. Our next waypoint, iMusi, or eMusi maybe? I don't know. It fulfills the same purpose. I just chose it because it lies in the general direction I would like us to go. If you're curious, it differs from Charlie Foxtrot Delta Zulu Bravo in that it's a reporting point, so air traffic control will know about this one. At any rate, it will take us to Cleveland's east side, which is the area I grew up in. We'll then turn north and head up to Kila Lima November, or Lost Nation Airport, and actually somewhat recently had its official name changed to Lake County Executive, but I'd wager that most locals still refer to it as Lost Nation. Clevelanders are stubborn like that. Besides, the old name just sounds way cooler. Lost Nation is a common practice area for pilots, and it has no control tower, but sometimes has less traffic than other airports in the area, and we'll use it as a reference point to turn west and head back towards downtown. After that, we'll land back at KBKL and see how we did. We're going to take this taxiway all the way down to the end. Remember when I said if you use a real-world weather, the winds might mess with you? Well, we'll be taking off from runway 24 right here, and if the wind isn't blowing towards us, it could make our takeoff roll a bit longer. It's one of the reasons we always take off into the wind. Normally we'd spin around into the wind here and do what's called a run-up to check the engine out, but we'll skip that today for brevity. Good thing it's just a sim. Okay, when you get to this double yellow line here, past the 2-4 right marking, stop the aircraft and set the parking brake. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the video here so our final flight video isn't too long. Hopefully you found the button mappings to be helpful if you needed it, and hopefully you didn't have too hard of a time with taxiing. If you did find taxiing difficult or you weren't able to quite get it, don't worry about it. We'll be revisiting all this in a later video. For the next video, just make sure you can get to this spot here holding short of runway 24 right, or you can always just change the flight plan so that your departure point is runway 24 right instead of ramp 5 parking. And then I'll pop you down right here at the end of the runway with the engine running and ready to go. In the next video, we'll run through a quick checklist and finally take to the skies. See you there. Ciao.